much for being here, either electronically or with physical presence. We have the honor and the privilege to have with us today Professor Andrew Herod, which is a distinguished specialist in labor geography. And this lecture is going to be held within the framework of the postgraduate course we give with Electra Petrakou named Geography of Mobilities. I think that the subject of labor geographies and this lecture is highly connected with the content of the course, because migrant labor is a very vital part of labor in general and labor process in general globally. And we are looking forward to hear Andrew in this very interesting lecture. And we will have then the opportunity to discuss a lot of things. I'm sure of it. Andrew, welcome. And
all right. Well, thank you very much. Okay. I will be very brief.
It's not my turn yet.
Not my turn. Very good. I will be very brief. Thank you very much, Andy, for coming here. It's a great honor and a great privilege to welcome you in our department. And we are really looking forward to build cooperation with you and your university. And we hope that this is just not the beginning, because it's not the beginning, but this is just the ongoing beautiful friendship, as the old movie used to say. And now I would like to give the floor to Kostas to say some words about Andy, about the speaker. And thank you very much again.
Thank you. So, Andy, thank you for being here. For those who don't know who Andrew Herod is, I've been working with Andy for some years now. We at the lab of economic geography here at the Department of Geography, and Andrew Herod is one of the prominent figures in the field of labor geography. I would dare to say at a global scale. He is a distinguished research professor at the University of Georgia in the United States. He has authored a multitude of books on globalization and labor, as well as papers in international scientific journals. Among his books, one can find the labor geographies, Workers and the Landscapes of Capitalism, or Labor, or Scale, so books about labor, globalization, and scale. And his main research interests revolve around the agency of workers and how that translates into spatial action, spatial sensitive action. So, Andy, thank you for being here. I don't know if you agreed with the things I just said, but in any case, you can make your case now. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Kostas. Thank you, everybody, for being here, whether you're physically in this space or whether you're in a different space somewhere else. This is my second visit to the department here. I was first here in 2015. And so it's a pleasure to be back and to meet some old friends and to get to meet some new friends. So Stelios had asked me to, and Kostas had asked me to talk a little bit today about the issue of labor geography, and just to sort of kind of introduce the topic, talk a little bit about kind of how it came about, talk a little bit about what it is that labor geographers, certainly in the English-speaking world, what they are focused on. So I'll talk for maybe a half hour, 40 minutes, something like that. And then if people have questions at the end, I'm more than happy to try to answer some.
So I've called this talk Labor Geography, Workers and the Making of Economic Landscapes. This is something that I'm particularly interested in, is the issue of landscape. Why do landscapes look the way that they do? How do we understand how they're made? And in particular, the role of working people in producing those landscapes. So in order to kind of talk about that, I'm just, as I said, going to really kind of give a kind of an overview of how labor geography as an area of research came about, certainly in the English-speaking world. And so it really kind of starts off, or what I want to start off talking about are some developments that really began in English-speaking geography, I would say in the 1970s, when a group of geographers became particularly interested in questions of landscape and questions of power, and how power shapes landscapes, but also how landscapes can shape the way in which power is exercised and used and enjoyed. And so, interestingly enough, two of the most significant theoretical contributions or influences on English-speaking geography comes from French-speaking geographers, or French-speaking people with a geographical imagination. Let's maybe put it that way. And these are Michel Foucault and Henri Lefebvre. And so, in terms of these two writers, both of whom are fairly well known, they were both interested in geography and space, but maybe in slightly different ways. But certainly in their work, we can see a focus on questions of space and the exercise of political power. So Michel Foucault was particularly interested in the way in which the spaces of many modern institutions, we can think about schools, we can think about factories, we can think about hospitals, we can think about prisons, the way in which space in those institutions is really used to control individuals and to shape their behavior. And so I've just kind of picked a few quotes from Foucault that kind of illustrate this point. So as you can see on the slide here, Foucault argued that space is really fundamental in any exercise of power. And he argued that discipline, by which he meant kind of social control, really proceeds from how individuals are distributed across space, so that there is a spatial aspect to the exercise of political power. And as I mentioned, he was particularly interested in looking at the way in which certain modern institutions, prisons, classrooms, like this one here, factories, the way that they are designed and laid out as a way to shape the behavior of the people that are inhabiting those places, whether it's students, whether it's factory workers, whoever it happens to be. We good now? Closer? Okay. Sorry. Usually I have a big mouth, so. So he was particularly interested in how the spaces internal to some of these institutions were organized as a way to control the behavior of those people within them. Henri Lefebvre, on the other hand, was more interested in kind of the relationship between the exercise of political power and the larger scale making of landscapes. And in particular, he was interested in the connections between how capitalism as an economic and political system functions and how it makes certain landscapes.
Viewing the first slide, I don't see when you change the slides, so give me a second.
We good? Okay. So this is the slide for talking about Foucault. So hopefully everybody got that. All right, now okay, now it's not forward, it's not. There we go. All right. So Lefebvre, as I said, was kind of more interested in kind of larger scale processes, and in particular was interested in the connections between the exercise of power, capitalism as a political economic system, and the landscapes that are made under in capitalist societies. And so there's a couple of quotes here that I think really exemplify what he was talking about. And these are both from his very famous book, The Production of Space, which was published in French in 1974. It's not published in English until 1991, which of course meant that most English-speaking geographers didn't read it till 1991 because most of them don't speak French. But there's a couple of quotes here that kind of really emphasize what he was talking about. So he argued that every society produces a particular space, or particular types of landscapes, and that we can think of these spaces then as very much being social products, and that they can be created in certain ways to control or to dominate as a way of expressing political power. And so basically what he was really interested in looking at was how capitalism generates landscapes in particular ways. And he was interested in looking at the way in which space itself, the physical construction of landscapes, in turn has a role to play in how political power is exercised and constituted. And so this quote here from his book, Production of Space, which is kind of a slightly long quote, but I think it's important to look at, really expresses what he was talking about. So he argued that capitalism has found itself able to attenuate, if not resolve, its internal contradictions for a century. And consequently, in the 100 years since the writing of Capital by Marx, obviously, it has succeeded in achieving growth. And he says, we cannot calculate at what price, but we do know the means, by occupying space, by producing a space. So he's basically arguing that the capitalist mode of production makes landscapes in particular ways, and that they look different from the kinds of landscapes that are made under other socio-political economic systems like feudalism or centrally controlled planning of the Soviet model, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so he argued then that there's a sort of dialectical relationship between the mode of production on the one hand and landscapes on the other. And so we can think about how the social relations of a society, a capitalist mode of production, shapes the production of landscapes in particular ways, but also then that the way in which those landscapes are constructed shapes the possibilities for social and political and economic action. And so this is really kind of summarized, I think, in this last quote here, where he says new social relationships call for a new space, and vice versa. And so I think this body of work in the French-speaking world had a significant implications for thinking about workers. And two implications that I think are particularly important is that it means that, first of all, there's a particular geography, particular types of landscapes that are produced under capitalism with which workers must engage. Workers are not, do not exist sort of floating outside the landscapes in which they inhabit. And so the way in which those landscapes are made, which reflects the way that capitalism as a political economic system functions, the way that those landscapes are made is important for how workers get to live their lives. The second part that I think, or the second implication that I think is important from this, is that it opens the door to the possibility that workers, through their behavior, through their actions, can shape the way in which the landscapes of capitalist societies are made. And so kind of thinking about workers as geographical agents really comes out of these two central points that themselves flow from the work of Foucault, but particularly from the work of Lefebvre. And so this kind of intellectual influence really had a significant impact upon English-speaking geographers, really kind of starting in the 1970s. And this is when English-speaking geographers who could speak some French began to read Foucault, but particularly began to read Lefebvre. And I'm thinking here of people like David Harvey, who I will talk about in a moment. And so to think about the nature of English-speaking geography at that time, the 1970s, when we think about how workers, how labor was theorized in English-speaking geography at that time, workers were really not theorized, working people were really not theorized as anything really but abstractions. So the main theoretical body of literature that economic geography drew on at the time was essentially neoclassical economics. It very much focused upon just simply looking at differences across the landscape. Okay, workers are paid this amount in this community and something else in a different community. Their rate of unionization is this percentage in this community, it's something different somewhere else. But the focus was really on understanding the making of landscapes really from the point of view of capital, collective capital, business decision makers, managers, those kinds of people. So as Doreen Massey, who's a very influential British geographer, argued in the 1970s, from this kind of neoclassical economic perspective, workers really didn't enter the picture as sort of real living people. Profit is the criterion. Wages are simply labor costs that are seen to vary across the economic landscape. And so in this regard, geography itself, landscapes themselves were really seen pretty much as just a kind of a stage upon which the interesting social, political, economic activity took place. So there was nothing particularly constitutive on the part of landscapes themselves. Landscapes were seen to be really kind of a reflection of the economic and political relationships in a society, but weren't really seen to play much of a role in shaping how those economic and political relationships played out. So the work of people like Lefebvre then starts to influence Marxist geographers in particular, starting in the 1970s and the 1980s. They start to think more critically and more imaginatively about the nature of space, about the nature of how landscapes are made. And four that we could talk about here very briefly that I think are particularly important that you see here listed on the slide. So the first of these is Ed Soja. So Ed Soja was a professor at UCLA. He actually was not in the geography department. He was in the Department of Urban Planning and Architecture at UCLA. And he wrote a very influential paper that came out in 1990 where he introduced the idea of what he called a socio-spatial dialectic. The idea that the way in which societies are organized spatially or organized geographically is a reflection of how they're organized socially, but at the same time, the way in which they are organized geographically shapes how they're organized socially. So this dialectical relationship between kind of social relations on the one hand and spatial structures on the other is an idea that Soja explores in a very famous article he published in 1980 in the Annals of the Association of American Geographers. Following fairly close after that came David Harvey. And David Harvey published an extremely influential book in 1982 called Limits to Capital. I know that Stelios and Kostas have had the joys of reading that. But here Harvey introduced the notion of what he called a spatial fix. And by that, what he meant was that in order for accumulation, for capital accumulation to occur, landscapes have to be organized in certain ways. Raw materials have to get to places where they can be processed. Workers have to be able to get to places of work, factories, where those raw materials are turned into commodities. The commodities themselves have to then get to the market. Consumers have to get to the market to be able to consume those commodities. All of those things require making the landscape in certain ways. For example, at a very basic level, if you don't have roads, it might be very difficult to get raw materials, let's say iron ore, from where they're dug out of the ground to where your factory might be. It might be difficult for workers, if they don't have housing close by, to live close enough to the factory to be able to come to work every day. So Harvey's really making the argument that the way in which the economic landscape is physically constructed as part of this, what he calls a spatial fix, is important to the process of accumulation. If your workers can't come to work every day because the workplace is too far from where they live, accumulation cannot take place. So for Harvey, capital accumulation and the making of landscapes in particular ways are really integrally connected. More or less at the same time, Harvey's, although he's British, he's writing in North America. Doreen Massey's a British geographer. She's writing in the UK. She publishes a very influential book a little bit later on called Spatial Divisions of Labor. She kind of makes a similar kind of point, arguing that the way in which societies are organized geographically is really important to the way in which they operate economically. And then Neil Smith at about the same time. So Smith was David Harvey's doctoral student. Smith publishes a book called Uneven Development, Nature, Capital, and the Production of Space, where he argues that within capital itself, there is a tension. So on the one hand, capital needs to be physically fixed in particular places for accumulation to occur. It doesn't occur on the head of a pin. But at the same time, capitalists also need to be sufficiently mobile that if better opportunities or opportunities for higher rates of profit emerge somewhere else, that's okay. So that if opportunities for higher rates of profit appear somewhere else, capital needs to be sufficiently mobile to take advantage of those. So there's this tension between needing to be fixed in particular places for accumulation to occur, but also being sufficiently mobile to be able to take advantage of new opportunities that open up somewhere else. So this is a geographical tension within the very constitution of capital between mobility on the one hand and fixity in place on the other. So in the 70s and early 80s then, in the English-speaking critical human geography, there's a lot of thought going into thinking about how do we understand the making of landscapes within a capitalist mode of production? How is it that landscapes under capitalism are made? Why do they look the way they do? So this was very important on the one hand, but on the other hand, it largely approached the question of how landscapes are made with by a focus upon capital, the actions of capital, collective capital. And so by the time we get to the late 90s, a number of people, including myself, but some others, people like Jane Wills in the UK, people like Don Mitchell in the United States, Jamie Peck in the US, and some others, are beginning to say, well, that's a really important set of theoretical ideas, but where does labor fit into this? Where do working people fit into this? And so increasingly in the 1990s and subsequently, we see the emergence of this field, labor geography. And the central argument here is that it's not just capital that needs to make a particular spatial fix so that accumulation can occur, and therefore capital can reproduce itself over time. But the workers also need to create landscapes in particular ways so that they can reproduce themselves either on a daily basis or on a generational basis. And so this is kind of at the center of the idea in the English-speaking world of labor geography, that workers have a vested interest in producing their own spatial fixes, so taking Harvey's notion of the spatial fix, but in a sense turning it on its head to look at how do working people make spatial fixes. And so it really draws inspiration from a passage in Marx. So Marx wrote a famous book called The 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. And this is about the coup d'etat that Napoleon III engineered in the 1850s to secure power. Napoleon III was the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. And so Marx in this book is talking about how history has a certain path dependence, that people are not entirely free to make their own histories. And so he expresses it this way. He said, men, although we should probably today say people, people make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. In other words, the past shapes how history unfolds. The tradition of all the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living, which I think is possibly one of the greatest sentences ever written in the history of the English language. So labor geographers kind of adopted this idea and kind of thought, well, okay, if Marx is talking about history and how the history of the past shapes the present and how what happens in the present shapes the future, what about space? What about landscape? And so we've kind of re-engineered Marx's sentence here a little bit as follows, which I think really summarizes the kind of theoretical perspective that labor geographers have on the way in which landscapes intersect with the ability of working people to create their own spatial fixes. And so it reads as follows. It says, workers make their own geographies, but they do not make them just as they please. They do not make them under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given, and transmitted from the past. The landscapes made by all the dead generations weigh like a nightmare on the brain of the living. So this is really at the heart then of labor geography as it has emerged in the English-speaking world. And so if we try and sort of think about labor geography in a broad fashion, I think there are a number of important tenets or a number of kind of key concepts or key ideas that are at the heart of English-speaking labor geography. The first of these is that workers are active geographical agents. Even when they don't realize that they are shaping the way in which the geography of capitalism unfolds, they are having an impact simply through the very nature of their existence. The second is that the kinds of economic landscapes that workers would like to see implemented, in other words, the kinds of spatial fixes that they need to be able to reproduce themselves, may not be the kinds of landscapes that capital, either individually or collectively, seeks to put into place. So workers, for example, may want to see a landscape of employment, because without wages, they may not be able to live. Capital, on the other hand, if it's more profitable to fire everybody, may prefer to see a landscape of unemployment. So we can see that there are different preferred landscapes, economic geographies, economic landscapes that workers and collective capital may prefer. The third aspect, though, is to understand that not all workers have the same geographical vision. Workers in some places may have a very different set of interests compared to workers in other places. So the third kind of tenet then is that different groups of workers are likely to have different visions for how they would like to see the geography of capitalism be made. Within those tenets, I think we can identify sort of 4 elements that have dominated research in the English-speaking labor geography tradition. So the first is really to understand how the way in which workers are embedded in particular places, they don't live floating in the air, they are embedded in particular places. And so how does being embedded in particular places shape the way in which they engage in political and economic and social behavior? How does it shape their social praxis? And so we get questions of how does workers' class consciousness or lack thereof intersect with their place consciousness? Everybody's from somewhere. We all have certain feelings maybe about where we live, where we are from, where we live, where we would like to live. How do those sometimes come into conflict with each other? You may think from a kind of a classical Marxist perspective, we may talk a lot about class solidarity, but we all know that sometimes workers in one community are not interested in developing solidarity with workers in another community, because if there's a factory making cars in one community and a factory making cars in the second community, and they know that one of those 2 factories is going to be closed, they want to make sure that their town's factory stays open and the other town is the factory that closes. So these connections to place may overwhelm any idea of a kind of a common class consciousness. The second element then is also to look at how workers engage with the unevenly made geography of capitalism. Capitalism, the landscapes made under capitalism are deeply uneven. We see places of tremendous wealth and places of tremendous poverty. So the landscapes that are made under a capitalist mode of production are not landscapes of equality, they're usually landscapes of inequality. And so how do those differences between places, how does that shape the way in which workers interact and behave? So to give you a simple example, if we think about a national union in coal miners, steel workers, office workers, doesn't matter what it is, a national union that is trying to develop, let's say, a national contract. How do they accommodate differences in how labor markets operate in different regions or in different cities into some kind of national agreement? This is a question of trying to balance different geographical sets of interests within one national labor agreement. As Humphrey Southall, who's a British geographer who was writing on some of these things in the 1980s, argued, he said, labor solidarity is inherently geographical. It's about workers coming together over space. And how do those geographical differences between places get negotiated, get handled as workers try to come together? The third set of research interests that many labor geographers have looked at is to think about how, when the landscapes that are produced under capitalism change, what does this mean for how workers may or may not go about organizing? So in the United States, for example, if you look at kind of the traditional model of labor organizing, going back to kind of the 1920s and 1930s, when the economy was largely a manufacturing economy, you had large factories with thousands and thousands of workers. A typical model for organizing was for a union to send a few organizers. They would stand by the gates and just hand out leaflets as the workers came in or they left. It was very easy to identify who were workers. They were often dressed differently. You knew when the shifts were going to change. So, okay, you've got to have your organizer there at 8 o'clock in the morning and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, because that's when one shift is leaving and another shift is coming. Organizing in the service sector is very, very different. Workplaces are much smaller. Workers often work much more closely with their direct supervisor. They often have some kind of feelings of allegiance maybe with their supervisor. They may be therefore less willing to talk to union organizers when they know that their boss is right next to them, maybe working on the same counter or on the same part of the office. And so this has led some of the unions in the United States and in other places as well to have to rethink kind of the geographies of how they organize. So one very famous example is janitors. So there was a series of campaigns that were introduced or begun in the 1980s in the United States around what was referred to as justice for janitors. Janitors, at least in the United States, often clean several different buildings in a shift. They might clean 5, 6, 7, 8 buildings in an 8-hour shift. So if you're focusing on trying to speak to janitors in individual buildings, that can become very tricky because they may not be in a particular workspace for a very long period of time. They're cleaning this office for 30 minutes, and then they go somewhere else, and they go somewhere else. So this justice for janitors figured out that, well, okay, maybe trying to organize it in the spaces of production is not a particularly good way of going about things. And so what they decided to do was a lot of street theater. They would go to cafes and these kinds of things and talk to people that were not necessarily the direct employers of the janitors, but they would talk about the janitors' working conditions in the hope that those people would then bring pressure to bear on the owners of the buildings where the janitors were working. So they really kind of shifted their focus from what we might call the spaces of production to spaces of consumption. The growth of global supply chains. Obviously, as the supply chain gets geographically longer, that raises questions about trying to organize over longer and longer distances. And then the final set of questions that labor geographers have been particularly interested in is to think about the creation of new geographical scales of organizing. So for example, what are some of the different geographical tensions between trying to organize, let's say, a national contract versus a series of local contracts? A national contract we can think of as maybe, in a sense, being a kind of a geographical average of the conditions in a country, depending upon the cost of living in certain places. A higher wage may be needed in some places and a lower wage maybe somewhere else. But a national contract maybe tries to kind of balance those to have some kind of national average. That's very different from local bargaining, where you may have very different types of wage rates in different communities based upon the cost of living. And so how do workers go from systems of local bargaining to maybe building new scales of organizing, which might be at a national level? So this issue of scale became very, very important. And within that issue of scale, of how workers go about creating new geographical scales of their organization, came the question of how do we conceptualize the geographical scales at which we think social life is organized. And so what I show here on the slide is 4 scales that we often use to sort of talk about and think about the way in which social life is organized. We might talk about the local scale, we might talk about the regional scale, we might talk about the national scale, we might talk about the global scale. So in English, I don't know about in Greek, but in English, the word scale comes from the Latin scala, which is for a ladder. Okay, so the Romans learned from the Greeks. So what I've shown here is a ladder. And this is a very common way in which we think about the relationship between scales, the local scale and the national scale and the global scale. And so it's a language of verticality, the notion that we kind of move up from a local scale to a regional scale or a national scale and then to a global scale. We kind of think of scales in this sort of vertically hierarchical manner. As suggested by the slide, in this way of thinking, each scale is somewhat a discrete arena of action. So Henri Lefebvre, the French geographer that I started off talking about, has a wonderfully evocative phrase. He talked about scales as being space envelopes. We can think about each individual scale, the global scale being a different geographical arena in which social life plays out than perhaps the national or the local scale. But in this metaphor, in this representation of the ladder, you move up or down from the local to the regional to the national to the global and upwards and then back down. In this particular metaphor, the global scale is not necessarily bigger than the local scale, but it sits above the other scales. And so, as I said, this kind of leads to a language of verticality. But there's another way that we can represent scales, maybe not as a ladder, but as perhaps a set of concentric circles, where the local kind of sits at the center and you kind of move out from your local community to the region, to the national scale, and then maybe to the global scale. So there are some similarities between this metaphor and the previous one. In both of them, scales are discrete arenas of action. They're discrete spaces. But this is a language of horizontality, not verticality. In the latter metaphor, you're moving up and down. In this metaphor, you're moving in or out. So the global scale in this metaphor doesn't necessarily sit above the other scales, but it is bigger than the other scales. It encompasses the other scales. So as I say, these two ways of thinking metaphorically about scales and the relationships between them have some similarities. They both see scales as separate arenas of action, but they also have some differences. The latter metaphor is a metaphor of verticality. This one is a metaphor of horizontality. And then comes along another French theorist, Bruno Latour, who said, well, no, this way of thinking about scales as separate geographical entities really doesn't capture the complexity of how the world is organized. And so he argued that rather than thinking of scales as being separate geographical entities, we need to move away from, as he puts it, notions of levels, layers, territories, and spheres, which don't really explain the complexity of the world. And that we need to instead think about scale using the metaphor of a network. So it's in some ways, it's kind of a very kind of postmodern way of thinking about scales. And so what Bruno Latour argued is that he said that if we think about scales like the local and the global, we should not think of them as being different layers or different levels, but rather as being things that, as the quote says, offer different points of view on networks that are by nature neither local or global, but are more or less long and more or less connected. So it's a very different linguistic, metaphorical way of thinking about scale. And so what I've tried to do here is kind of show this with a couple of different images. So the one on the left is an image of earthworm burrows. And we can maybe think about the surface of the earth is where the earthworms burrow in, and they sometimes go deep, they sometimes go shallow. And the deeper they go, we can perhaps think of that as being more local because it reflects the kind of the complexity and the richness of local life, and the global is maybe a little bit more abstract. We can see this with the slide on the left with the earthworm burrows, or we can maybe think of it in terms of sort of tree roots, maybe on the right-hand side. And again, we can kind of think about the tree roots going deeper into the specificity of the local, but at a more shallow level, maybe being representing kind of a more abstract globality. We could also flip this in a different way. We could think about where the tree trunk enters the earth as maybe being the local, and then that spreads out, the roots spread out to kind of a more regional, national, and global scale. So either having global closest to the Earth's surface or local closest to the Earth's surface. The metaphor can work either way, although it obviously has slightly different connotations. And so in this regard, then, we think of scales in this, following from Bruno Latour, we think of scales not in aerial terms, but in network terms. And so in this perspective, it becomes a bit more difficult to say where one scale ends and another begins. But it also means that the language that's used to talk about scales in the other examples, some scales as being larger or smaller than others, or more encompassing or less encompassing, really doesn't make as much sense. How do I get rid of this? Well, it's just because it's the last, it's the bottom part of the slide, and you can't see. And I can't read it. There's a way to hide it, I know, but hide video, is that? Nope, that's not what I wanted.
You want to show the last
Hide this bit. Yeah. Hide floating meetings. That one. Yeah, there we go. Lovely. And so in this metaphor, then it makes much more sense to talk about scales as maybe going deeper or being more shallow. All right, now it won't. Sorry, I need my IT guy again. Oh, no, all right, never mind. Sorry, forget it. All right, so why is this important? Well, it's important because how we think about how the world is scaled shapes how we behave in it. And so just to give you a very simple example, we often think about multinational or transnational firms as being global. And the use of the word global brings with it a certain set of connotations about power, about omniscience, about omnipresence. And corporations themselves often like to say we are a global corporation. And part of the reason that they do that is when they are presenting themselves or are presented as being global, it makes it much more difficult for us as citizens or us as workers to imagine challenging a globally organized company. But if we were to think about that very same company, rather than as being global, but instead being multi-local, it has, I haven't even finished yet. It has operations maybe in Greece, maybe in Italy, maybe one in Germany, one in the UK, one in France, one in the United States, one in Canada. So it stretches across the globe. But if we think of it as being multi-local rather than global, that I would suggest reshapes what we think is possible. It suddenly becomes much more within the realm of possibility, I think, to challenge something that we see as being multi-local than something that we see as being global, because the power of that word, the global, certainly in English, I imagine probably the same in Greek, I don't know, but the power of that word global seems so overwhelming that it doesn't seem even possible that we could begin to challenge something that was globally organized as we are stuck here in our localities. If we think about that same company as being multi-local, that opens up possibilities to thinking about how to organize against a company in very, very different ways. That's not to say that the company materially is organized any differently, but the discourse that we use to talk about it, and this is kind of sort of coming out of kind of post-structuralism now, is really very significant. So just to finish up, just to summarize, I think when we're talking about labor geography in the English-speaking world, there are a number of things to think about. So the first key issue, obviously, is that social actors, whether that's workers, whether that's capitalists, whether it's anybody else, are geographically embedded in particular places. And the fact of that geographical embeddedness shapes how they behave and the possibilities for their behavior. The second is that different sets of social actors are differently connected across space, because they're differently connected into different local or regional or national or transnational relationships. And this itself shapes their political and geographical praxis. Organizing locally versus organizing transnationally are very different situations. The third thing, just in summary, is that obviously different sets of social actors have very different geographical or very different spatial visions with regards to how they would like to see the geography of capitalism made. And that these different geographical imaginations can spark significant conflicts between them. How capitalists want to see the landscape made may be very different from how workers do. How one group of workers wants to see the landscape made may be very different from how a different group of workers. How one group of capitalists would like to see the landscape made may be very different from a different group. So these geographical conflicts in vision can significantly shape political practice. A fourth aspect is that making of new geographical scales of organization is often central to workers' political praxis. How social actors behave geographically shapes the way in which landscapes are made. And so we have to think now of landscapes as being politically, socially contested things. They're not simply neutral stages upon which social life plays out, but there a lot of political conflict involves actively shaping and reshaping the way in which the landscape, the economic landscape, is made. And so that means then that landscapes don't simply reflect social relations, but are constitutive of those social relations. So that idea of the socio-spatial dialectic that Soja talked about. This in turn means that in order to understand workers' political and economic practice, we have to understand how the possibilities for their actions are shaped by history and how history has been made, but also shaped by geography and how landscapes have been made in different ways in different places at different times, and how there's a certain degree of path dependence in those landscapes. The way that landscapes were made yesterday is going to shape how people can behave in them today. How they behave in them today is going to shape how they're made tomorrow. And that we also have to think about, when we think about workers' geographical praxis, we have to think about it not just in the paid workplace, but also how other aspects of their lives shapes their behavior. So we can think, for example, of what happens in the home and how domestic labor is divided, often in a gendered manner. Women have certain types of responsibilities often that men do not, like looking after children. That can then shape the kinds of opportunities that they have for paid employment outside the home, and that in turn shapes the way in which landscapes are made. Just the final point, final slide. I think it's also important that if we're trying to understand kind of the development of Anglophonic labor geography or labor geography in the English-speaking world, I do think that there are four things that we need to understand as the field has developed. So in the early years, I think it's fair to say that much of the focus was particularly on organized, unionized workers who had paid employment. And there were certain reasons for why that was. I think in the early days, much of the effort was to try to develop kind of the theoretical argument that workers play an active role in shaping landscapes. And the theoretical argument was bolstered by the empirical research, because working people generally have a greater impact when they work together than when they work individually. Unions tend to have good records, so there was a good empirical data that researchers could kind of get into the archives and see, well, how did unions develop geographical strategies for this situation or that situation. So it wasn't so much that labor geography was argued to be about unions. It wasn't. People were very explicit that that's not what it was about. But a lot of the early empirical work used the example of unions because they were good. It was a good example to illustrate the theoretical, conceptual developments that we were trying to develop. Since then, the empirical field has expanded far beyond unionized workers in the global north to include many other types of case studies of many other different types of workers. I think a second issue that's fair to say is that in the early days, and we're talking about in the 1990s now, a lot of the empirical research was focused upon the capital-labor relationship, and not a lot of thought went into thinking about the role of the state and how the state shapes the relationship between capital and labor and what that means for how landscapes are made. I think another aspect or another criticism of some of the early labor geography was that it tended to have a slightly simplistic view of agency. In other words, that anything that workers did was considered to be agency. And I think some of the work more recently has tried to think about different types of agency and how the power of workers to shape the landscape may be greater in some instances than it is in others. And then finally, I think that it's fair to say that in the early decades, first couple of decades or so of kind of the development of labor geography, there wasn't much attention paid to nature and kind of the ecological, the socio-ecological. So if we think about the natural world, obviously the natural world plays a significant role in the way in which capitalism has developed over the centuries, and the way in which space is produced and the way in which nature is produced socially are connected. And both of those, the way in which the environment is made and the way in which the economic landscape are made, can significantly impact workers' lives through things like the spread of disease, worker health, the production of what is needed for workers to reproduce themselves, so food, that kind of stuff. All of those obviously have a foothold in the natural world. And I think it's fair to say that the early days of labor geography didn't really think much about the natural world. But that was also, I think, is sort of changing in the last few years. More labor geographers are starting to write about how do workers interact with the natural world, and how does the way in which the natural world is constituted shape the ability of workers to engage in political praxis. So that's it. I kind of talked for a little bit longer than I'd anticipated, but I am an academic after all. I also used to be an elected official. I used to say that as an academic and an elected official, I could talk about nothing forever. So sorry if I went a little bit over my time, but that's kind of my view on kind of the development of labor geography in the English-speaking world. I'm happy to sit here and answer any questions, or if you've had enough of me, I'm happy to pack up my stuff and leave. So. Any questions?
Hi.
Hello.
My name is Sotiris. I'm an undergrad student in the Department of Geography. I have a couple of questions, but I'm probably not going to ask all of them. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So
you mentioned the need for mobility as well as the need for structured planning of an area in order to facilitate capital accumulation. How can that affect the structure of modern cities and the growth of extra-urban areas?
How does mobility affect them?
Mobility and structured planning affect modern cities and extra-urban areas and their growth? When a factory moves around, so they need to go to different places. There will definitely be a growth of the economical.
So obviously, I mean, as capital, if we're talking about capital mobility, that as capital moves from one place to somewhere else, some places get developed and other places get underdeveloped. You know, workers that might have been employed in a factory when it was in city A or country A, if that factory moves to city B or country B, those workers may not be able to follow that work. And so the movement of that factory may benefit some workers to the detriment of those who are being left behind. So I think when we talk about capital mobility, that clearly has an impact upon how the landscape, the economic landscape is made. But I think it's also important to think about labor mobility as well, because many industries are and have historically been reliant upon migrant labor. And the way in which that migrant labor is generated and then controlled is really important for the way in which those industries develop. So I'll give you two quick examples. So if we look at the South African mining industry, that's 140 years old, more or less. That industry has always relied upon migrant labor. Most of that, or much of that migrant labor, is not from South Africa. It's from across the southern part of the continent. So from Namibia, Mozambique, Zambia, Angola. Without that labor migration, the industry would not be able to function. But the South African state, particularly under the apartheid period, realized that it was dependent upon that labor migration, but it only wanted certain types of workers, men. It didn't want men bringing their wives and their children and grandma to come from Angola or wherever to come and work in South Africa, because then the South African state would have to pay to take care of those people. So the way in which work permits were established and set up allowed certain types of workers in and not others. We can see the same thing with the Gulf cooperation countries right now. You know, countries like Kuwait, Qatar, their economies are dependent upon long distance international labor migration for people coming from places like India and Pakistan and Southeast Asia. But only certain types of people are allowed to migrate, and it's highly regulated. You can only work for a particular employer, so you are trapped to that employer. You can't find a different job. In the case of Australia, that was the other example I want to talk about. The mining companies have been really clever in trying to control their labor. So in the western part of Australia, there's an area known as the Pilbara. It's very remote, and it's an area of iron ore mining. And so starting and most of that iron ore is dug out of the ground and it's sent to China. But in the 1950s and the 1960s, the iron ore mining companies decided that they wanted to create company towns in the mining areas, so that they would have the miners always there, so they could be working the mines 24 hours, 7 days a week. But very quickly, the miners, because they were all living together, started to organize, and they organized a very powerful union. So this obviously created a problem for the mining companies. It's got a very powerful union here. So what the mining companies started to do was to implement a new system of labor control. And they introduced a system, it's known as fly in, fly out. So rather than having the miners with their families living in where the mining was taking place, they moved the families to the big cities, Perth, Melbourne, Sydney. Some even live in Indonesia. That's where the families are, and the miners are then flown in. They work for 2 weeks maybe, and then they go back to live in Sydney or Melbourne or Perth or whatever. And that was a way to break the union, because two things happened. One, when the miners were in the iron ore area, they were working. And I've spent time in that area. It is hot. It's a desert. Like it's if you're working a 14-hour shift, you don't have any time to do anything, least of all talk about unionization when you come off your shift. I mean, I've seen these guys at the airport and they are dead to the world. They're so exhausted. But it also meant that we might all be miners, we might all be working together, but I might live in Perth, you might live in Sydney, you might live in Melbourne, and we don't get to meet outside work with those kinds of informal relationships where you go and see, you go and see a movie together, or you go to the pub together, or you play soccer together or something. And those kinds of informal relationships are really important for building solidarity. So the unions have had a problem in trying to organize when the migrant workers are now they're working together, but they're not living together. So I think, to kind of come back to your question, I know I'm giving a long answer, but that's just the way it is. But I mean, I think capital mobility obviously creates development in certain places, and it creates underdevelopment in others. But I think it's also important to think about labor migration as that is a kind of spatial fix as well. Certain types of capital are reliant upon labor migration. Mining industry in South Africa, the mining industry in Western Australia. But for workers themselves, migrating is also an important part of their own spatial fix. So countries like the Philippines, many young men and young women leave the Philippines because there's not enough work there, and they go to places like Saudi Arabia, they go to places like Kuwait, they work there, and then they send money back to support wives and children and grandparents. So that's kind of a sort of a labor migration spatial fix. Obviously, that affects the nature of urbanization, because it means that in countries like Qatar or Kuwait or Saudi Arabia, these migrant workers have to live somewhere. And oftentimes they're in basically company created mini cities, big kind of compounds. So I don't know if that answers your question, or whether that answers the question that I thought you'd asked, but that's kind of my thoughts on it, at least anyway. But yes, so the issue of capital spatial fix might be reliant upon migrant labor. For workers themselves, part of their own spatial fix might be migrating. If there's no work in their community, they have to find work somewhere. It's a great question, especially from an undergraduate. Yes. Yes, of course. George. Yes.
Hello.
Hello.
It was a very interesting. I found very interesting the whole.
Okay. Thank you.
I was trying to catch your thoughts, and I tried to, and I now have some questions. I'm Nikos, by the way. My name is Nikos. I studied geography here. Well, what's the main difference between the multi-local way of understand geography and the way workers and people act was assigned global. So what's the difference between multi-local scale and global scale?
So I think what I was trying to say there, maybe not very clearly, is that certainly in English, and I imagine in Greek as well, when we invoke the power of the word global, I mean, this is a powerful word, and we associate it with things that in some ways there's kind of no escape from. When you say something is global, it gives the impression that there's nowhere on the planet that you can go to escape from something that is global, because the global, the power of that word means it is something is everywhere. And so what I was trying to suggest is that many corporations like to present themselves as, well, we are a global corporation, you know, whether it's General Motors, whether it's Apple, pick any big company, and look at their advertising. We're a global company. And I think they do that because it leaves the public with the impression that they are everywhere all the time, then you can kind of never escape from them. And so if you are the workers working for Apple or General Motors or pick a company that has presented itself as global, if you are stuck in your little community, Mytilene, Athens, Greece, Athens, Georgia, where I live, you know, the other Athens, if you're stuck in your little community and you're thinking and you're working for that company and you're thinking, gosh, you know, our wages are really poor, our working conditions are really poor, but how are we ever going to organize against a global company? You've almost lost the fight before you even started to think about it, because it's such the way that the global company presents itself as being global means that the possibility of beating it seems remote in the extreme. But if you can create a narrative where you say, well, okay, Apple likes to say it's a global company, or General Motors likes to say it's a global company, but actually Apple phones are virtually all made in one place, Shenzhen in China. General Motors has factories in particular places. I don't know if there's a GM factory here in Greece, but no, okay. But in the United States, there are particular communities where there are GM factories. There are particular communities in Europe where there are GM factories. And so if we start to think about companies as being multi-local, maybe they have 10 factories in 10 different communities, thinking about organizing 10 local campaigns that are connected across space becomes more imaginable than organizing a global campaign against this sort of company that's perceived to be everywhere, omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent. And so that was kind of my point, was it doesn't change the way that the company itself is materially organized, but it changes the way that we think about how it's organized. And that change in representation can maybe open us to possibilities that we had not previously thought about, because we had thought there's no way we can challenge a global corporation. But if we think of it, well, it's a company that has 10 factories in 10 different places. We just need to get 10 campaigns going in the 10 different cities and connect them together. That seems much more possible than having a global campaign. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay. Good.
Thank you.
I like this student. He understands what I'm saying. That's right. But it's really about language. It's about the power of language. Yeah. And imagination. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What is exactly? It's about what we think is possible. Because if we don't think something is possible, then you never start to organize in particular ways. Because what's the point? If you don't think it's possible, what's the point?
Yeah, Randy, I would like to ask the postgraduate students that they are participating by distance here if they want to make any questions.
Sure.
And we thank them very much for their participation.
Yes. Even though they may not be physically in the room, they are spiritually in the room.
Yes, of course.
So yes, if anybody online anywhere, has any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. Well, if he asks in Greek, somebody will have to tell me what he's asking. My Greek is limited.
Thank you. I would like to ask you about the circular diagram that you showed us in one of your slides. Consisted of four scales: the local, the regional, the national, and global. Wouldn't we suggest that one consists of the other? I mean, the regional scale is consisted from the local scale, and as far as it goes, the national scale consists of those two behind it. And as we engage in the globalization of the 21st century that is connected directly to the capitalist economy, which many countries have embraced so far, what the spatial relation to the industrial actions? So how this globalization as a theory can affect the industrial energy actions globally? Thank you.
So I think the answer to your first question is yes. I mean, I think that we can kind of think about the national as being made up of many locals, and we could think of the global as being made up of many national scales. So the image is really designed to that circular image that you talked about is really designed for us to think relationally. How are these different scales connected? And I think what I was trying to say is that with the circles, it's a different image of how they're connected than with the ladder. Because with the ladder metaphor, scales are above or below each other. With the circle metaphor, scales are either enclosed or are enclosing of other scales. And it's not to say that one of those is correct and one is wrong. It's to say that they are different, and that depending upon how we think, do we think vertically or do we think horizontally, that's going to shape how we understand the world as it is, and therefore how we behave in it. So the purpose of kind of thinking about those images is to think about the metaphors that we use to think about the world, which then shapes how we behave in it. There's another one that I've used. They come from a book I published, and there's lots of different ones I could have used, but one which I didn't, but which I think speaks specifically to your question, is one of the Matryoshka dolls, the nesting dolls, where that's very clear. You know, the local was within the regional, which is within the national, which is within the global. We can think of other metaphors. So the point is not so much that one metaphor is better than another. It's just that different metaphors get us to think about things in different ways. And one metaphor may open up possibilities, but close others. Metaphor A may open up ways of thinking about the world over here and close off ways of thinking about the world over here. Metaphor B may open up ways of thinking about the world over here, but close off ways of thinking about the world there. But I agree with you. We could think of how the local is maybe incorporated within the regional and the national and the global. And I think the Russian nesting dolls is actually a better image for thinking in those terms. In terms of the question about globalization, I think that's a really interesting question, because when I was your age, a long time ago, we didn't really talk about globalization. We talked about internationalization. And the language of globalization really only comes about, I would say, in kind of the popular imagination in the 1990s. It's certainly in geography. Maybe Stelios can remember because he's even older than I am. No, he's not. But all of a sudden in geography and other social sciences in the 1990s, people were talking about globalization. Prior to that, people really talked more about internationalization, the international order, international institutions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what's really interesting in that is that when we talk about the international, we are by definition talking inter, meaning between nation states. So international, the focus is really on the nation state, the national scale of organizing economies. When we talk about globalization, we have shifted our scale of imagination from a series of different nation states that are interconnected to one increasingly singular, almost kind of smooth, like a soccer ball, integrated whole. So that changes the way in which we think about how the world is organized. Is it organized as a series of interconnected, basically still nationally organized economies, or is it organized as one increasingly integrated, smooth, unitary entity? The reason that's a really interesting question is for two reasons. Depending upon, do we think about the world as a series of interconnected, still essentially nationally organized economies versus an increasingly integrated singular economy, shapes how we behave, going back to what we were just talking about. So that's the first interesting question, how that change in language shapes what we think is possible, what we think is going on, how that shapes our behavior. The second really interesting question, I think, is to ask the question, why was there this change in language from kind of the use of the term international, which was kind of the dominant way of talking about things really up until, I would say, about the 1990s. The shift from kind of the language of international to a language of the global. Did that mirror an actual material change in the way in which the world is organized? Or was it simply a discursive shift to get us to think in different ways? Because if we start thinking increasingly in terms of the global rather than the international, implicitly, that means that we are diminishing what we consider to be the power of nation states, which of course is all tied up in kind of neoliberal ideology. Because if you can diminish the perception of the power of nation states, you can help to abolish certain ways in which nation states regulate economies, because people think that nation states are no longer powerful. So why try to get our national parliament to implement, minimal health and safety rules, rules on precarious employment, these kinds of things? Because if we think that nation states are basically increasingly powerless, there's no point in trying to find a national political solution to certain types of issues. And so I think that the change in the language fits very neatly into kind of the neoliberal discursive logic, which is if people don't think that nation states are powerful anymore, they start to behave as if they were not powerful anymore, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think that's why this language is really important, to think about the terms that we use to describe the world that we think we're living in. But as I say, for me, I grew up, I grew up in the 1960s and the 1970s. I'd never heard of the term globalization really until the 1990s. That's when it kind of came along. When I was your age, we didn't talk about globalization. We talked about internationalization. And it has a very different connotation and a very different it presents the nation state in a really different way. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah, I don't want to take all the time. I'm, as I say, I can talk forever about nothing. Okay. Well, they might be 3 fast questions. They may not be 3 fast answers.
Hello.
Hello.
My question is, how will the rise of AI and remote working affect the quotes landscape of or labor geography?
So I think that's a very interesting question, and myself and 2 Australian colleagues are actually writing a book about this right now, which we hope will come out either later this year or early next year. So, I mean, I think the notion of things like telecommuting is changing the nature of what it means to go to work, for one thing, because, you know, historically going to work meant leaving your home, or at least if you were going to work for paid employment, but leaving your home to go to an office or to a shop or a factory or whatever. I think increasingly with online work, that notion of going to work has a very different geographical connotation to it, because you may be going to work may mean going from your bedroom to your living room to sit behind a computer all day. You're not physically leaving your house. So I think there are some interesting questions about what does that mean for how we think about the landscape of work. Where is it taking place? Or paid work, because obviously a lot of unpaid work has always happened in homes and will continue to happen within homes. So that's one issue. I think the rise of online work changes the way in which labor markets operate. For certain types of activities, you are really now increasingly talking about a global labor market, whether it's people working on Amazon Turk, where or MTurk, I think is what it's called, where people can, you know, that need, let's say, clerical type activities done. You can post on this site, and people from literally anywhere in the planet could do the work for you. So I think for certain types of activities, it's making certain labor markets increasingly global. It really doesn't matter where many of the workers who are doing this work are located. They could be in Greece, they could be in Australia, they could be in India, they could be wherever. But the other thing that is also happening is with the growth of automation and digitalization, some of the processes that led to outsourcing over the last few decades, namely the search for cheap labor, some of those processes, when you don't need as many workers because you're engaging in automation and digitalization, not only does that undercut the pressure to outsource, to move your operation overseas, because you don't need thousands and thousands of cheap workers anymore, but it also, by lengthening the chain of control and communication, it can make it more difficult for companies to run their operations when a lot of that work is being done by people overseas that they never physically see. You know, I mean, we've all gone through the pandemic and everything's been on Zoom. I'm sure it has not happened in today's class, but you know what happens when you're on Zoom. You get distracted, and so for employers, it can be challenging for them to control their workers over this longer distance. And so what we've found is that for certain types of activity, because of automation and digitalization, where you don't need as many cheap workers, some of those companies are actually onshoring that work. They're bringing that work back because it allows having the work being done in a closer geographical setting allows them to exert much greater control over their smaller labor forces. So I think I think depending upon the specifics, the process of artificial intelligence, digitalization, automation, these kinds of things is going to have different geographical implications depending upon what it is we're talking about, where it is we're talking about. And that's going to keep us as geographers busy for a long time. So there is a future for creative, innovative students to do some research in this area, I think.
Okay. Are there any general processes that workers can make use of to counterbalance the burden of the already existing landscapes in small communities? How accessible and important can education on the matter of class awareness get in order to facilitate meaningful thought from labor workers themselves?
So if I had a really good answer to that question, we would be living in a utopian paradise right now. I mean, I think so some of the work that I have done, I did do some work with the United Auto Workers in the US, probably 20 years ago. There was a series of strikes against General Motors, and General Motors, the strikes, there were two strikes that took place in two communities in Michigan, which is in the northern central part of the United States. But because General Motors was using just-in-time systems of inventory control and components delivery, those strikes rippled across the landscape in a very short space of time as assembly plants basically ran out of components, because with the just-in-time systems, you literally have the components delivered a few minutes before you put them on the vehicle. And so if components factories are on strike, as was the case in this situation, the assembly plants quickly ran out of parts, and so they have to close. Although I did joke that based upon seeing some drivers driving cars without turn signals did not seem to be a problem. So they could be coming out of the factory and it wouldn't affect some people's how they drove. But the point being that the order, the geographical, or the order, excuse me, in which these plants closed was based upon how they were organized, how they were connected in terms of their delivery of components and acceptance of components, not necessarily how physically close they were to each other. So in the case of General Motors, a lot of its components at that time and still were being made in Mexico. And so it was interesting that you had a dispute in Michigan that started to impact some assembly plants, some of which were close to Michigan, some of which were a long way away, but they had to shut down because they couldn't get the specific parts that were being made in these two factories that were on strike. As the assembly plants closed down, they didn't have anywhere to store components that would have been coming in. So the components factories in Mexico started to shut down. As they started to shut down, that then affected other assembly plants that were reliant upon the things coming from Mexico. So what was really interesting was to look at the order in which these plants closed. And it wasn't that they were close together geographically in the way in which we might think of suppliers and assembly plants being physically close together. They were close together in terms of their organizational space. And so the work that I did, and I worked with the United Auto Workers, which is the big auto union in the US, was to map the order in which these plants closed, because for the union to try to get workers to understand that they were kind of all in this together required them to understand how they were connected across space. And workers might be working in two General Motors plants in the same town, community, but they may not have been, they might have been close physically, but they were not close in terms of the organization of the General Motors North American system of production. And so to get workers to understand concepts of solidarity, class consciousness, and these kinds of things often requires getting them to understand how they are connected in space. And sometimes that's very obvious because you live in the same community, but sometimes you might be connected across thousands of miles of space. Workers in Michigan connected with workers in Mexico that they will never see, they will never interact with, they will never cross paths with, but they are functionally connected because of the way that their plants are structured in the overall system. And so I think, from a geographical point of view, I mean, we like to sort of think about being activists and playing a role in reshaping the world to, I mean, Marx said the point is not to understand the world, the point is to change it. I think that one way in which we can do that is to try to help people to understand how places are connected, how their lives are interconnected, even though they may live literally on different sides of the planet. So again, I don't know if that necessarily answers your question, but that's certainly when I'm kind of thinking about my work as a researcher, but also in teaching. I mean, when I teach, I'm very keen to get the students, who are 18-year-old kids, many of whom have come from small towns. They've never going to the university is the first time they've been out of their small town, but to get them to think about how their lives are connected with people in other parts of the world that they will never meet, but their behavior impacts those people and the behavior of those other people impacts their behavior. And so I think that's the power of a geographical imagination. And I think that's the power that we have as teachers and researchers, is to reveal those kinds of geographical connections out of which some kind of change can maybe come.
Thank you for your presentation. I will, following your last bullet about nature and its relation to labor, my research is about energy transition and its effect on labor regimes and how workers are acting. So in my fieldwork, I came upon people who told me that the main public discourse is that coal production is closing due to climate crisis, which is a global phenomenon. So what I figured out is that that many people felt entrapment with this global situation, and how can they act in the local level against their own interests, because acting in favor of environment and stop coal production means that they are going to lose their jobs. So it is like a polarized discussion, and that's one thing that puzzled me: how workers can overcome this globalized discourse. And I think this connects to what you said earlier about language and the global notions, the scales, and how workers are trying to envision their own future, and how could they act to in order to create their own geographies. Yeah, I don't know if this is like a question or a comment, but I'd like.
Well, I don't know as much about the specifics of the coal industry here, but there's similar kinds of debates happening in the United States. And when I first went to the US, I lived in a state, West Virginia, which is in Appalachia. Coal mining is the #1 industry there. And for 100 and something years, a lot of communities have grown up around the coal mine. And so the notion that coal will go away is very scary to a lot of people because it means they don't have a future. And so one of the things that the coal companies have been very successful in doing is convincing people that the reason that jobs are being lost in the coal industry is because of all of these environmentalists and these, save the planet do-gooders. If you actually look at what's going on in the coal industry, certainly in the United States, in states like West Virginia, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, it may be the same here, I don't know. Most jobs have not been lost because of restrictions being put on coal being burned in power plants. Most jobs in mining have been lost because of automation. There's a tremendous amount of automation in mining coal, which has meant that thousands and thousands of jobs have been lost simply because machines have replaced people. Mostly men, but there are also female coal miners in Appalachia. So that's kind of one aspect, is to actually talk to people in the mining industry. Why are you losing your job? And to look at, is it really because of environmental rules and regulations about burning coal, or is that the real reason, or is it because the mining has been automated? And I don't know about the specifics of the Greek industry, but I have this sneaking suspicion that automation's probably played a role in the closing of some of those. I mean, the other aspect of it is at a certain point, if we don't deal with the climate crisis, we're all going to die. I mean, that's a pretty final ending to your coal industry or your coal job. And so, but it's a real concern. It's very easy for me, who is not a coal miner, to say to somebody else, well, for the sake of the planet, you have to lose your job. That's easy for me to say because I'm not the one that's being affected. But I can give an example from a different industry that I think is possibly a way forward, where we could eventually transition away from coal or fossil fuel, which I think all of us would probably agree at some point has to happen. Otherwise, we are all going to die. But also where the burden of that does not fall entirely on the coal miners and their communities. And so when I did my doctoral research long time ago, I actually did it on dock workers. And I was really interested in the transition in the industry from the middle of the 20th century to the end of the 20th century, really starting in the 1950s when containerization came along, those big metal boxes that you see on ships and on trains and trucks. And that those containers required a lot less labor, because beforehand, when a ship came into a port, you had thousands of men, mostly, virtually all in the US case, loading and unloading ships. Now, all you needed is a much smaller number to move those containers. And so the dock workers union said to the shipping companies, they said, okay, we'll do you a deal. We won't oppose this new technology, but you have to buy us out of our jobs. You have to guarantee us an annual income, whether or not there is work for us to do. And I think that's a possible solution for the coal industry as well, that the coal companies, or if it's a national, I don't know about in Greece, if it's a nationalized industry, I don't know, but the coal companies or the government or somebody says, this is the quid pro quo we will do. This mine needs to close because of all the environmental stuff. You coal miners are not the ones that are going to be burdened by this. Because closing the mine is collectively, in the long term, in all of our interests, we collectively are going to share the burden, and we will buy you out of your jobs. We will give you a guaranteed income, maybe for you and your children. So we're talking about a several decades long promise. We will pay you an income whether or not there is work for you to do. And that seems to me to be a a fairer way of engaging in the kind of transition that I think if we all sat down, even maybe some of the coal miners, if they sat down and thought about what kind of a world do I want my children or my grandchildren to live in? Is it one where we've basically destroyed the planet, or is it one where we have some opportunity to make some changes now that can help bring about a better future? So I think that's one way of maybe in which the conversation could be shifted. Now that obviously takes organizing, because it takes pressuring government or the coal companies or whoever is in control of the industry in Greece, in this part of the world. It takes organizing, you know, because they're not just going to say, oh, that's a really good idea. Here's a whole, you know, billions and billions of euros. They're not going to do that. So it's going to take organizing. But I think that's the kind of conversation that maybe needs to happen, where you're not placing environmentalists and coal miners like this. You're actually creating a situation where there might be some common ground, where the coal miners might say, okay, we will give up our jobs, but we're not going to be the ones that shoulder that burden alone. So it's all about kind of how you present the narrative, I think. Make sense? The questions are short, the answers are long. That's my problem.
I would like, to step on the previous question, comment. So we're talking about the working class. Marx used to talk about, I don't know, in Greek books it's proletariato. How we call this in English? Proletarium? How we...
Proletariat.
Yeah. So it feels like it's changing by the time, and sometimes it's like there's a, like, for what you were talking about, like a geographical awareness of the working class or the proletarium, if you like. It's like this is something that is changing, and sometimes maybe well, me, I study Marx. I don't hide myself. I'm kind of okay. I can say that. Okay. So what you said is like the geographical awareness you were talking, like, or no, of the working class, and how they understand the area they're working in, maybe the local where they're working, and where they actually are and what they're doing.
Well, no, I mean, I just...
it's oh, okay, sorry.
I mean, well, no, I guess what I would just say, just very quickly, I mean, I think that if you're thinking about, class solidarity, knowing solidarity comes out of having a commonality with somebody else. Yeah, I mean, that's the definition of solidarity, is we're all in this together. And so I think the geographical aspect comes out of that, by understanding how we are connected. But it's also important to understand that, I mean, Marx, you know, you gotta love him, but he wasn't a very sophisticated thinker when it came to geography. Very sophisticated when it came to thinking about historical transformation. He got some things wrong, in my opinion, but he wasn't a very sophisticated thinker when it came to geography and spatial difference. And so I think that at a certain abstract level, it's fairly easy to say, well, okay, the singular working class has a singular set of interests, because they're workers. They give up surplus value, surplus labor, their labor creates surplus value for their employer. So at a certain level, yes, but we don't live as individuals in an abstract world. We're connected to particular places. And so to say that there is a singular working class or proletarian objective or interest isn't very realistic, in my opinion. People live in different places. They have connections to those places. They like or dislike those particular places. So I think any kind of working class politics that's about building solidarity has to think about how do class interests intersect with geographical interests around place. And sometimes the two coincide, and sometimes they pull at each other. That's just the nature of life, I think. And organizing successfully and building a successful solidarity movement requires us understanding that class plays out and is constituted differently in different places, and we have to understand the connections between places to show how people in different places, workers in different places are connected, and where are there perhaps commonalities around which we can come together. Because we're not going to come around, working people around the globe are not going to all have the same set of interests. I mean, they have different cultures, different histories, different ways of thinking about things. And I think that's the trick. And I think that's why geography is actually, in many ways, such a potentially revolutionary social science, because it gets you to think about the connections between people in different parts of the world and how can you use those to build a sense of commonality. No.
Thank you very much, Andy. It was very nice. I think the questions were very good, and I think we've all taken something from here, even you.
Especially me.
Disclaimer, the visit of Andy here was funded by the Regional Excellence Program. Costas is over there at the corner taking notes.
Very good.
So he will take care of you if you behaved well.
Okay.
He will evaluate that. And thanks to the people running the program. Thank you, Andy. The work that we are making together with Andy is much more than this visit. It expands over papers and projects. We are building an observatory that Andy is a scientific associate, so you can all check this out. It's about the EU and labor data on EU. So that's all from me. Thank you.
All right, well, and thank you for hosting me.